Before we start discussing microeconomics in detail, we'll be talking about institutions. Most of the modern economies, especially after the 1990s, are market-based or capitalist economies. You might have heard the term capitalism a lot, and often capitalism is compared with other institutions like socialism, communism, or dictatorship. But in this class or in this course, we'll be focusing on capitalism because microeconomics is often closely connected with capitalist system of production. Before even we go into details of capitalism, let me present you some facts. So what this graph is showing is the time period starting from 1000, that means 1000 AD till 2000. So this is years, and this is GDP per capita. That means how much an average person in a country makes. Or to put it differently, if you take the income of a country and divide it equally among all its people, that gives you GDP per capita, and GDP is gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. That's GDP. And there are 5 countries here: India, China, Italy, Japan, and Britain. Now, what this shows how much is the GDP per capita in each of the years. One of the things you see, the income per capita for most of these countries are very stable. It really didn't budge a lot for most of the human history. Then something started changing in the 19th century, that's 1800 onwards. First, Britain started growing up. So is countries like Italy. And then Japan started growing really fast in first half of the 20th century. And in the second half or towards the end of the 20th century, countries like China and India started growing really fast. So there's a big increase in income of the people living in these countries. Now, the graph doesn't show US, just to give an idea. Around 1800, average US income or per capita GDP was approximately $1,200 in today's dollars. Today, how much is the per capita GDP? As of 2020, per capita GDP is approximately $56,000. So there's been a huge increase in income even after accounting for inflation, because we accounted for inflation here. There's a big increase in income of the people of this country. An average person enjoys much higher standard of living than anybody in the United States, even in the beginning of the 19th century, even in the beginning of the 20th century. Today, an average person has a car, or rather multiple cars. An average person has a computer. Average person has a cell phone. Average person has a big television. So these are very common things which was completely missing 100 years back. So this rapid and sustained growth in living standard that happens since 1700, question is, how did it happen? What changed in last 200-300 years so that human race, not only in the United States, not only in Britain, but pretty much throughout the world, started experiencing a huge increase in standard of living? And all these things happen in a very short period of time if you look at the human history. So to understand this, first we'll try to understand the role of technology. So one thing we can all agree is that technology changed a lot over the last 200-300 years. It started with Industrial Revolution, and Industrial Revolution is known for the coming of new technology like steam power or electricity. All these are the driving forces behind what we can experience a huge living standards. So first let's define technology. So technology can be defined as a process that uses inputs to produce an output. So any process that takes in some raw materials and inputs like land and labor and capital and produce some outputs, which outputs can be your hamburgers or your televisions or your education, the class that you are taking, or it can be as simple as internet services or gaming services. Anything that you buy and sell, buy in the market is an output which is produced by somebody in this world. Now, how technology interacts or how technology changes. Now, one way we can understand this is looking at how much light an hour of work can produce. And this is pretty much related to the Washington Post article that we did previously. So this graph shows that it's a lumens hours per hour of labor. That means how much lumens is a measure of light, is produced here. So higher and higher. And this is the years ago. So almost 100,000 years ago, if you worked an hour, you barely produced about what, 20 lumens per hour. Today, if you work an hour, we are producing almost 10 million lumens. That means 1 hour of work today can produce 10 million lumens worth of light. But 100,000 years back, even 40,000 years back, even 20,000 years back, human race was pretty stagnant. Now this smaller graph is nothing but this is showing a magnified version of this area. So this is nothing but this area, that's what they are showing. So what you can see here is a huge increase in our power to produce more. And all this is possible because of the development of technology. 200 years back, if you want to light something, your best bet was to buy a candle and get as much light as you could. But today, you just flip a switch. There's a electric bulbs. Even today, nowadays, we have LED lights, electricity. They all do magic in terms of brightening up our environment. The amount of light that we get today at a very cheap price was impossible even 200 years back. So this is how the technology progresses. So what technology does, it makes human being more productive. That means you can produce more in a short period of time. So technology is the starting point, which leads to increased labor productivity. That means labor productivity often measures as output per hour of work. So question is, if you work for 1 hour, how much you produce? And production can be as simple as burgers or as complicated as NASA's spaceships. So technology helps with increased productivity because we as laborers or workers can use technology to make us more productive. And finally, it shows up in increased standard of living. The idea is very simple. If you produce more, you get to eat more. And we can produce more if we use right kind of technology. Think about if you want to go from, say, Albany to New York City. In the old days, your best bet was maybe a horse cart. Today, you can fly, you can drive, you can take a bus, you can take a train. So if you take a bus, it takes about 2.5 hours. If you take a flight, it takes about 45 minutes. But if you are going there on a horse-driven cart, it might take more than 2 days to reach there. So that makes us more productive because now we can get done more in a very limited period of time, because time was always in short supply, no matter whether you are living 100,000 years back or today. Now, another major question that arises, what drove this technological change? How was it even feasible? All this happened because something called capitalist revolution. So capitalism became the key thing that emerged as an institution in the 17th and 18th century to drive the industrial revolution that led to the huge increase in standard of living that we experience today. Prior to capitalism, there was feudalism. Prior to feudalism, in many parts of this world, there was slavery. Though slavery did persist in US till the middle of the 19th century, but that was a very outmoded mode of production. So what is capitalism? What does it mean? So capitalism is an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit. So in a capitalist system, all the sellers are trying to earn profit, and they always own the means of production, and some of the means of production are labor and capital. Now, you may say, who can own other people's labor? Well, under slavery, your owner owned your labor. Or under feudalism, you couldn't innovate because you are pretty much on the beck and call of your feudal lord. But under capitalism, you are free. You can decide whether you want to work, whether you want to work 1 hour a day, whether you want to work 16 hours a day. This is all your choice because you own your own labor, which is very important for production purposes. And some of the central characteristics of capitalism are private property, markets, and the firms. So all these three institutions work together to make capitalism a success. So let's try to understand this. So this is economic activity with private property. Now private property existed for a long time, but that was a self-sufficient family production system, that you own your own production system, which was not very efficient. Then from here we came the markets. That means where there's an exchange of goods and services started taking place. And finally came the firms. Firms are an important part because firms means businesses. Now suddenly we realize from market, you don't have to only sell in your local market. You could sell anywhere in this world. Think about today's iPhone, perhaps many of you use. iPhone is designed in California, but they are assembled in China, and most of the parts are produced in multiple countries in this world. So all these things come together at a global scale because there's one firm, that Apple, who decided to do it in this way by using a specific technology. So market, private property, and firms needs to come together to make capitalism a success. So let's try to define private property. So private property means ownership rights over possession. That means you are the owner of something. Market means any place where exchange of products and services can take place because of mutual benefits. Now, you will not exchange goods and services if you are not mutually benefited. Now, in a market, there's a buyer, there is a seller. Seller only sells if the seller earns profit. That's the benefit. Buyer only buys if that product they're buying, it gives them satisfaction or it has use. For example, if I'm hungry, I can go to a market and buy bread because bread feeds me. On the other hand, the seller of the bread or bakery sells me bread because they are making money out of it. So it's a mutual benefit. That's why exchange happens. And finally, firms. Firms are nothing but a business organization that uses inputs to produce outputs. So firms is the place where technology do their magic. Firms decide what kind of technology to use. So they get this technology, they get raw materials, they get labor, they get capital, put it together, and they do magic in terms of producing all sorts of goods that you buy in a day-to-day life. So finally, I'm going to answer a question: what is economics? What does it mean? So economics is a study of how people interact with each other and with their mutual surroundings, producing their livelihoods, and how it changes over time. So economics is nothing but study of our exchanges and in our natural surroundings and how we earn our livelihood. Typically in an economy, there are two big groups. One is firms, that means businesses. The other is actually households. Households where labor resides. Labor is in the household because they are the one who are going to supply. So what households do? They supply labor to their firms. And what against that, what households get? They get finished products, finished goods. So firms give finished goods to the households, households gives labor, and also firms bring in raw materials, capital, which is also machinery, technology, all these things together to produce these finished goods to sell to the households. So this is a circular process. And in microeconomics, we are going to study the firms, the households, and finally the market. Because in the end, firms and households exchange their labor and the goods in a market. Now, in our next lecture, we'll start with firms. So firms is the starting point, and then eventually go up to market in microeconomics.